The U.S. pullout from Afghanistan was a messy one. 20 years later, and after $3 trillion or more in spending, the U.S. has pulled out. But is that the end of the war machine? Definitely not. Hi, I'm Kavitarwe, and in this edition of Economic Divide, we will look at how the U.S. is gathering up its resources and energy to deal with its arch foe, China. Coming up in today's program, the U.S.-Afghan pullout. The U.S. readying for serious engagement with China, economically and even militarily. This reset, can it pull it off? Or is it too late to stop China's economic prowess? We'll have to wait and see. One of the other highlights of this program, Afghanistan, not the last U.S. pullout. Reports of U.S. pulling out of Syrian bases, Iraq, as it has stated, and maybe even Yemen. Even the U.S. said the U.S. was bogged down in West Asia for too long. Is that a retreat for the U.S.? And finally, the economic challenges for the U.S. in dealing with China, technologically and through trade. But doesn't the U.S. need China more than China needing the U.S.? The U.S. decision to withdraw from Afghanistan marks the U.S. defeat of time and money. The Afghan war cost the U.S. taxpayers over $2 trillion in revenues, in which interest on the loan to carry out that will be paid for years to come. This pullout, however, has posed an opportunity for a new geopolitical space for China. And if the U.S. continues to withdraw from countries in the West Asia region, like Syria, Iraq, and possibly its support for Yemen, this may give China, and maybe even Russia, a chance to fill that space.
Well, most of the countries realize that the situation has changed from the time with the collapse of the Soviet Union, where you really had one superpower. That one superpower has exerted its power in a variety of ways, not least of all in Afghanistan, as a dismal failure. And most of the countries have seen that. People are not, generally, they don't hate the United States, but they're very cautious in dealing with the U.S. because of this intensive feeling among many of the political elites here in the United States that we have got to set the rules.
Countries like Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and Persian Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia will more likely welcome a more active China, especially with the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative. So detrimental to U.S.'s so-called superpower image was the Afghan pullout that East Asian countries like Japan and South Korea may also think twice about siding with the U.S. in countering China.
I mean, even countries like in Europe, even our so-called allies, really frown on the fact that the United States should not be the rule setter, that other countries have to have a say because they have a general interest. And in particular, most of the countries realize that China, which they don't always understand so well, really also wants to have a say in what direction the world goes in. And from what we can see of their own development, there's a lot of positive things they're doing. The Belt and Road Initiative, this has brought development to a world where development had been lacking for the last 2 or 3 decades.
There are obviously think tanks in the U.S. who believe that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was indeed necessary, not only because it was due time, but also because the threat that the U.S. sees from China, whether perceived or not, requires a lot of resources and money. Now, these are the main points of their argument. First, it could liberate military resources for the U.S. currently that was tied down in Afghanistan, allowing them to be redeployed to the Indo-Pacific theater, as it's called. And then it could also free up the diplomatic and bureaucratic bandwidth of U.S. senior officials. And finally, it could save the U.S. government money, unlocking billions of dollars that could be better devoted to fund initiatives that would boost America's standing in its competition with China. Well, our guest joining us for this edition of the program is Zhao He. He is a research fellow at the Institute of World Economics and Politics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Okay, Zhao, welcome. Do you see a relation between the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan and the way that the U.S. wants to deal with China in the economic and technological sphere? in respect where the U.S. is trying to allocate and channel its resources to confront China and to not continue spending it in places like Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think these two things are very much connected. And as we all know, since 2017, American national security strategy has changed. And since then, the U.S. has been trying to focus on China and reallocate its strategic asset towards the so-called Indo-Pacific area, and particularly focus on China. So under that overall strategy, continue to pour resources into Afghanistan is very problematic and strategically not worth it. So I think that's why, since the Trump administration, the U.S. has determined to pull out of Afghanistan, and actually President Biden just finished the job. And so far, you can see that I think continuously the U.S. will move its assets, military intelligence, and other assets towards the Asia Pacific, and particularly focus on China, as I said. And the U.S. will use more other method, including export controls, sanctions, and other non-military methods against China, instead of trying to continue to use its superior military capability around the world.
Time now for our Info News section, where we will look at stories that may become topics for our next program. Now, for our first story, we're going to take a look at China and its rejection of big tech. This article stated that China's rejection of big tech monopoly capitalism is the focus for China, and it doesn't want to basically see China going the route that the U.S. has done. First of all, how is it going to be able to do that? Well, it's going to refuse allowing its homegrown technology companies to be dominant in the way that Amazon and Google are in the West. We can mention Alibaba, for example, and basically it wants to put its focus on manufacturing, to make a long story short. Next up, BRICS Summit. It had one, and the BRICS nations, composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's an important meeting, have met. The host country, even though it was a virtual meeting, I should say the host was the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And he focused on three things which were the theme of the summit, the three C's: cooperation, for continuity, and consolidation. Now, BRICS is still relevant because it does have investments for its member countries into different sectors. Next up, U.S. national debt, obviously a big factor for the U.S., and it's on track to default, as of the recording of this program, on its national debt for the month of October. We have to wait and see if that happens. By the time this program gets aired, maybe it's going to be solved. But it's an ongoing problem. Basically, the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, said that if this happens and the debt limit is not raised, it will be the first time in U.S. history. This is basically has come out to be a bipartisan theatrical politics, so to speak, because at the end it always gets solved. Finally, breaking U.S. sanctions. Yes, Iran has done it again, delivering its first fuel shipment to Lebanon. That is a big deal because it shows that U.S. sanctions did not work. Iran is invincible towards it. In this particular case, Lebanon needs the fuel badly. The way it did it, it entered Syria to transfer to Lebanon and did that via tankers. It's time now for our in-depth section. Here we are going to devote what the U.S. may lose by focusing on China after pulling out of Afghanistan. First, the U.S. needs China more than China needs the U.S. economically speaking. For example, the U.S. depends heavily on China for providing low-cost goods. Now, this is especially applicable when it comes to income-constrained American consumers. Now, these are American consumers who are having a hard time making ends meet. Now, moving on to the other area where the U.S. depends on China, it has to deal with exports. China is America's third largest export market, next to Mexico and Canada. That obviously is something that should concern the U.S. Now, the U.S. also depends on China to provide funding for its budget deficit. You can see over here $1.3 trillion is how much debt or foreign holder of U.S. Treasury securities China has in direct ownership. Imagine a lack of Chinese buying. That could turn the next Treasury auction into a rout. And finally, this is a bitter truth that is the outcome of the structure of the U.S. economy's weakness when it comes to Americans' spending habits. America depends on China because Americans don't have enough savings. For example, in the fourth quarter of 2017, the net domestic saving rate was just 1.3%. That was the national income. Now, how will it be able to increase Americans' savings? Well, in order to consume and grow, the U.S. must import surplus foreign savings from abroad. That is the naked truth. And run massive balance of payments and trade deficits to import this capital. But how can it do that when the U.S. had trade deficits with 102 nations? That's right, 102 nations. Okay, let's bring in William Jones for a breakdown. He's the Washington Bureau Chief for the Executive Intelligence Review and a non-resident fellow of Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies. Bill Jones, welcome. Why did the U.S. fall behind China, estimated to take over the U.S. as the #1 economy by the year 2028? I mean, is it because of the U.S. spending monies on wars, for example, across the globe and its military bases, instead of focusing on things like infrastructure or education and scientific development in areas like 5G?
Well, obviously, the situation of Afghanistan has created a situation where the United States, which is pulled out, doesn't really have much influence on the development in Afghanistan. They have no representations on site. They're withholding money to the Taliban and waiting and see what happens. China, on the other hand, has really taken a forward position here. They do have a relationship with the Taliban. They are willing to help. The Taliban, in its turn, has said that they really would want to work with China. But the U.S. is still concerned with what happens in Afghanistan because it doesn't want it to become a center of terrorism and have the same problems they had 20 years ago with the 9/11 situation. Will the United States stop their freedom of navigation forays into the South China Sea? Will they stop trying to really impose a technological apartheid on China through trade tariffs and like? I don't think that's going to happen. But there has to be some give in this situation on the part of the U.S. in order to maintain stability in the relationship.
The story of the U.S. losing its status as a so-called superpower is being highlighted these days, especially after its messy withdrawal from Afghanistan. Marred by COVID-19, its economy has not fully recovered from the pandemic.
There's still clearly a huge amount of open positions. There's still clearly a shortage in some industries. There's still clearly a problem with some industries that require more certifications and things like that are time dependent.
In the meantime, under these harsh circumstances for the U.S., it is insisting on confronting China. China, in the meantime, has achieved success in its fight against poverty. It has put forth the grand vision under the leadership of its president Xi Jinping to vitalize its rural areas in his fight against poverty.
President Xi Jinping rightly celebrates the success of China's targeted poverty alleviation campaign, which by the end of last year, 2020, had brought about 100 million of the intractably poor out of extreme poverty. For China to achieve the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, eliminating extreme poverty was necessary, but it was not sufficient. China must continue to fight poverty by reducing still substantial relative poverty and close the still excessive wealth gap, primarily between rural and urban areas. Enhancing rural standards of living exemplifies China's long-range vision to the years 2035 and 2050, when China's goal is to become a fully modernized socialist nation. And President Xi allows no delay in making the historic transition from poverty alleviation to rural vitalization. Without the vitalization of the countryside, there can be no social stability, no common prosperity, no national rejuvenation. But while grand visions are formulated by central leadership, they must be implemented by local grassroots officials.
It has also issued a white paper to elaborate on its prosperity. The white paper said that China had completed the historic transformation from poverty to securing access to food and clothing, to a decent life, and finally, to moderate prosperity. This against the unsuccessful backdrop of U.S. efforts.
They've also gone for poverty, the first country, biggest country in the world, which has effectively eliminated extreme poverty. We haven't even done that in the United States. And those are things that I think should be markers for most countries and for humanity at large. And most of the countries in the world realize that this is a positive element here, and they want to work together with it. So I don't think they're going to simply follow the bugle call of the United States to go to a conflict.
But the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan has one main purpose: to secure its resources and to channel it against China. And it is not just Afghanistan that the U.S. has withdrawn its forces from. Drawdowns have been reported in Iraq and in Syria, with Yemen to maybe in the works. The West Asia region is no longer of U.S. interest, and the reason may be purely for profits. Brown University's Costs of War project released a report that revealed that the Pentagon spending totaled over $14 trillion since the start of the war in Afghanistan, with 1/3 to 1/2 of the total going to military contractors. A large portion of these contracts, 1/4 to 1/3 of all Pentagon contracts in recent years, have gone to just 5 major corporations: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. The report explained how China is the new justification for military spending. The most likely impact of the shift towards China will be to further tighten the grip of major weapons makers like Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Raytheon Technologies on the Pentagon budget, as the report reads.
Well, I think the U.S. Current relative decline has multiple sources. One, of course, is that after 9/11, the U.S. has very much invested in the so-called war on terror and invest so much that its domestic need has not been met. So over the years, we've seen numbers like very high numbers that the U.S. has invested in its war capabilities, and it's deploying military around the world, particularly in the Middle East and in Central Asia. So that's really a waste of money. However, a small group of Americans really benefited from this, and the U.S. Stock market, the capital market, also benefited from this. During this time, as you said, there are many domestic problems should be taken care of, but not being taken care of because of political divide within the United States. So, and political difficulties blocking that solution. So, as we've seen over the past 2 decades, the infrastructure is lagging behind, and also there's a serious problem of social and economic gap between the rich and the poor. So moving forward, I think the number one priority for the U.S. should taking care of its domestic problem instead of intervening into other countries' internal affairs.
Southeast Asia will take a major economic hit if shipping is either disrupted or, worse yet, blocked in the South China Sea. Now, that's one of the points of conflict between the U.S. and China in what is known as the South China Sea conflict, and in particular, how that serves as a trade route. Now, the U.S. wants to take the revenues produced in that region. That's somewhat of an assumption, but it seems like that is the U.S.'s goal, to take those revenues away from China or decrease it by a substantial amount. Well, to get the final comments from our guests, Jia Hai, who's a research fellow at the Institute of World Economics, and also Bill Jones, who's the Washington Bureau Chief for the Executive Intelligence Review, both rejoining us for this final segment. Jia, I'm going to start with you and our final question. The U.S. superpower status downgraded by many across the world, many analysts, be it militarily or in the economic sphere, but the U.S. is still pursuing China. On a military level, does the U.S. alienation mean that it will not have the support of countries, not only in the Asia region, but also in Europe and elsewhere, in the respect where they're not going to be on board with it to confront China?
Well, I think, first of all, the U.S. continued to be the world's most powerful country. That's for sure. Even though with current relative decline, the U.S. still maintained a superior military power comparing to all the rest of the world combined, pretty much. So I think in that respect, U.S. continued to lead in its military realm. However, the world is now diversifying, and there are multipolar other powers arising, and this world order is changing from the post-Cold War unipolar into a multipolar world. Many other countries, including Europe and China and other developing countries groupings, are having a say in international affairs. So U.S. has no monopoly on many other issues. Many other countries can contribute in the area of like the pandemic or climate change or urgent issues that humanities are facing currently.
All right, well, Bill, the U.S. superpower status downgraded by many, as was mentioned here, whether it's militarily or in the economic sphere, and it has fallen behind China, which is said to overtake the U.S. Economically by the year 2028 for it to be the #1 economy. Is it because of the U.S. spending expenditures on wars across the globe that this has happened to the U.S.? We could mention military bases and military spending overall.
Well, yes, that latter is, both are the case. The fact that they have spent a lot of money in military wars, which have led really nowhere except to further devastation. Afghanistan is a prime example of that. You can also look in the Middle East and see the same type of situation. But also there's been a neglect, an utter neglect of investment in science and technology. And what the Chinese have done, with a population of 1.4 billion people, by the way, is they have followed much the example that the United States was following in the 1960s. We have to continue, exerting ourselves. The almighty dollar will buy whatever we need, and therefore we don't have to do a lot of investment in science and technology, so that they became, in many respects, backwards, and the Chinese have moved forward. U.S. still remains a major scientific power, and I'm sure
the so-called superpower status of the U.S. is in jeopardy. And the U.S. is declining in its might, both in its economy and also its military. Yes, even the military. Because the U.S. can't win a conflict by air, and its ground forces, well, they couldn't even defeat the Taliban when they had 100,000 forces combined with NATO forces in that country. And now they want to take on China in the business and military arena. So desperate that the U.S. had to send its VP Harris recently to Asia to rally support around her during her recent visit, of the regional countries, that is. And as far as U.S. war adventurism is concerned, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, need I say more? No wins there. So obviously, remains to be seen how the U.S. is going to be able to even penetrate China's sphere economically and militarily. That does it for this edition of the program. Thanks for tuning in. From me, Kaveh Tafway, and the entire team, it's goodbye until next time.